October 24th, 1943. A beach in New Guinea. A 24-year-old Australian sergeant kneels in the sand, blindfolded, hands bound behind his back. Behind him stands a Japanese officer, sword raised high, frozen in the split second before it falls. This photograph would become one of the most haunting images to emerge from the Pacific War. But the question that has troubled historians for over 8 decades isn't what happened in this moment. We know exactly what happened. The question is, how did a young radio operator from the suburbs of Sydney end up on his knees on a remote beach, 3,000 miles from home, about to become a symbol of a war's darkest chapter? And why, when this photograph surfaced after the war, did it shake the foundations of international military justice? The answer begins not with death, but with an ordinary life that took an extraordinary turn. Leonard George Siffleet was born into a world still reeling from one world war, unaware that an even greater conflict loomed on the horizon. Growing up in suburban Australia during the 1920s and 30s, there was nothing in his early years that suggested he was destined for the shadows of covert warfare. He was, by all accounts, unremarkable in the best possible way, a young man with a family, friends, and a future that seemed reasonably predictable. But history has a way of reaching into ordinary lives and pulling them toward their extraordinary ends. When war broke out in the Pacific, Australia found itself facing an existential threat unlike anything it had experienced before. The Japanese advance through Southeast Asia was swift and brutal. Singapore fell. The Philippines fell. The Dutch East Indies fell. Suddenly, Australia wasn't a distant colonial outpost safely removed from European conflicts. It was the next target on the map. Young Australian men enlisted by the thousands, and Leonard Siffleet was among them. He joined up, received his training at Victoria Barracks, and learned the basics of military life: drill, discipline, the weight of a rifle, the particular discomfort of wool uniforms in Australian heat. But Siffleet's war wouldn't be fought in the open. He wouldn't march in formation toward enemy lines or storm beaches with thousands of other soldiers. Instead, he was selected for something far more dangerous: Z Special Unit, one of Australia's most secretive special operations forces. These weren't the commandos who captured headlines. These were the men who disappeared into enemy territory with false papers and radio sets, who lived among the enemy for weeks or months at a time, gathering intelligence that could shift the course of entire campaigns. The selection process was rigorous. They needed men who could think independently, improvise under pressure, and above all, keep secrets. Men who could operate entirely alone, knowing that if something went wrong, no one was coming to save them. Siffleet trained for this new kind of warfare. He learned radio operation, the intricacies of transmitting and receiving coded messages. He learned how to establish hidden communication posts, how to recognize the sound of Japanese aircraft engines from Australian ones, how to move through hostile territory without leaving traces. Most importantly, he learned the protocols that governed all intelligence work. Frequencies changed weekly, call signs rotated constantly, and you never, ever carried anything that could compromise the network if you were captured. The assumption underlying all of this training was simple and brutal. If you were caught, you were on your own. You couldn't break under interrogation because by the time they caught you, everything you knew would already be obsolete. In late 1943, Siffleet received his orders. He would deploy to Papua New Guinea, deep into territory occupied by Japanese forces. His mission was straightforward in concept but terrifying in execution. Establish hidden radio positions, monitor Japanese troop movements, and transmit intelligence back to Allied command. He wouldn't be going alone. 2 Ambonese soldiers, H. Pattiwal and M. Reharing, would accompany him. These men knew the country in ways Siffleet never could. They understood the terrain, the climate, the complex politics of local tribes who might help you one day and betray you the next. They were his guides, his partners, and ultimately they would share his fate. The three men inserted into New Guinea and disappeared into the jungle. For weeks, they operated in absolute isolation. Every few days, at predetermined times, Siffleet would power up his radio set, send brief encrypted bursts of information about Japanese positions and movements, then shut down again before detection equipment could triangulate his location. It was exhausting, paranoid work. Every sound could be an enemy patrol. Every local tribesman could be an informant. Sleep came in brief snatches. Food was whatever they could carry or forage. The jungle itself was an enemy. Leeches, mosquitoes carrying malaria, tropical diseases that could incapacitate you in hours. But the intelligence they gathered was invaluable. Allied command needed to know where Japanese forces were concentrating, which supply routes they were using, whether they were reinforcing or retreating. From Siffleet's hidden positions, transmitted in coded bursts that lasted only seconds, this information flowed back to headquarters where it was assembled into the larger picture of the Pacific campaign. He was one small piece in an enormous puzzle. But without pieces like him, the puzzle couldn't be completed. Then came the betrayal. The exact circumstances remain unclear even today, lost in the fog of war and incomplete records. What we know is this: local tribesmen, either coerced by the Japanese or motivated by their own reasons, revealed the location of Siffleet's team. Perhaps they'd been promised payment. Perhaps they'd been threatened. Perhaps the shifting allegiances of occupied territories made cooperation with the Japanese seem like the safest option. Whatever the reason, the result was catastrophic. Japanese forces surrounded the position. There was no firefight, no dramatic last stand. Siffleet, Pattiwal, and Reharing were simply taken. The radio went silent. Back at Allied headquarters, when the scheduled transmission didn't come, they would have waited, hoped for equipment failure or a missed window. But as hours turned to days, they would have known. Another team lost behind enemy lines. 3 more names added to the list of those who wouldn't be coming back. The 3 captured men were taken to Itape, a coastal town that the Japanese had turned into a regional military center. For approximately 2 weeks, they were held and interrogated. We can only imagine what those 2 weeks were like. The Japanese military in 1943 had particular methods for extracting information from captured intelligence operatives. The interrogators would have wanted everything: radio frequencies, encryption protocols, the locations of other Allied teams, upcoming operations, anything that could compromise the intelligence network. They would have been systematic, persistent, and increasingly frustrated as they realized that even if Siffleet wanted to cooperate, and there's no evidence he did, the information he possessed had a built-in expiration date. The frequencies he'd been using were already changed. The call signs already rotated. The protocols already updated. By the time of his capture, Leonard Siffleet's operational knowledge was largely worthless, but that wouldn't save him. By October 1943, the Japanese military's treatment of captured Allied personnel, particularly those engaged in irregular warfare or intelligence operations, had become increasingly brutal. The official position was that such personnel, operating out of uniform behind enemy lines, were not legitimate prisoners of war entitled to protections under international law. They were spies, saboteurs, unlawful combatants. The penalty was death. On October 24, 1943, the sentence was carried out. Siffleet, Pattiwal, and Reharing were taken from their holding area to Itape Beach. If you've made it this far in this story, I need to ask you to do something. This video represents weeks of research into a moment of history that matters, that deserves to be remembered, and that we have a responsibility to tell accurately and respectfully. If this story is resonating with you, if you believe these kinds of histories need to be preserved and shared, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss future documentaries like this one. And if you're willing, leave a comment below telling me what other untold stories from World War II you'd like to see covered. Your support makes this kind of deep historical research possible. Now, let's continue. The beach at Itape is unremarkable. Coarse sand, the kind that gets into everything. The ocean close enough that you can hear the waves breaking, that regular rhythm that continues regardless of human events. On that October morning, the 3 condemned men were brought to this beach. They were forced to kneel in the sand. Their hands were bound behind them. White cotton blindfolds, probably torn from someone's shirt, were tied around their eyes. Through the fabric, they would have been able to sense the brightness of the equatorial sun, that diffuse glow that makes the inside of your eyelids red. They would have heard the ocean. 7 seconds between waves, sometimes 8. They would have heard boots in the sand, the scrape of steel being drawn from scabbards, that particular whisper of a blade leaving its sheath. And someone had a camera. This detail is crucial to understanding what happened next. Japanese military correspondent or officer, the records are unclear, was present with photographic equipment. The decision had been made not just to execute these 3 men, but to document their execution. Perhaps it was meant as a deterrent, evidence to show other captured personnel what awaited them. Perhaps it was simply standard documentation of military justice being carried out. Perhaps it was something darker, a trophy photograph, proof of enemy combatants eliminated. Whatever the intention, the camera was there. The executioner was a Japanese warrant officer named Yasuno Chikao. He raised his sword behind the blindfolded Siffleet, and in that fraction of a second before the blade fell, the shutter clicked. The photograph captured that terrible moment. A young man kneeling in sand, spine straight, posture somehow maintained even in extremis. Behind him, the raised sword. Around him, other Japanese personnel watching. The image is crystal clear, technically well composed, and absolutely devastating in its clarity. There's no motion blur, no convenient shadow obscuring the scene. It shows exactly what it shows. The sword fell. Leonard George Siffleet died on Itape Beach at age 24. Beside him, H. Pattiwal and M. Reharing met the same fate, though no photographs of their final moments have surfaced in historical archives. 3 men executed for the crime of gathering intelligence in wartime, for doing exactly what their orders required them to do, for serving their cause in the shadows where victories go unrecorded and deaths go unmarked, except in official casualty lists. The photograph should have disappeared. In the chaos of the Pacific War, with film and cameras in short supply, with dark rooms makeshift and unreliable, this single image could easily have been lost, destroyed, or simply forgotten. But it survived. Months later, as Allied forces pushed back Japanese positions and recaptured territory across the Pacific, the photograph was found. The exact circumstances of its discovery vary depending on the source, but the most consistent account is that it was recovered from a captured or killed Japanese soldier who had kept it among personal effects. When intelligence officers saw it, they immediately recognized its significance, not just as evidence of a war crime, but as documentation of a fate that had befallen countless Allied personnel whose executions had never been photographed. Never been proven, never been anything more than missing reports and families waiting for news that would never come. The photograph began its journey through military channels. It was catalogued, copied, analyzed. Intelligence officers tried to identify the victim. The uniform suggested Australian forces. The context suggested special operations. Cross-referencing with lists of missing personnel, they eventually arrived at a name. Sergeant Leonard George Siffleet, Z Special Unit, listed as missing in action since October 1943. Now confirmed killed. The 2 men executed beside him took longer to identify, and in some records their names are still rendered incompletely. Pattiwal and M. Reharing, Ambonese soldiers whose service and sacrifice would be footnoted in histories that centered the Australian sergeant. As the war ground toward its conclusion and Allied victory became inevitable, attention turned to questions of justice and accountability. The photograph of Siffleet's execution became Exhibit A in a much larger case about Japanese treatment of prisoners of war. Throughout the Pacific Theater, there had been systematic violations of international law governing the treatment of captured personnel. The Bataan Death March, the Burma Railway, mass executions of surrendered troops, medical experimentation on prisoners, and countless individual atrocities documented in survivor testimonies and captured records. The Siffleet photograph was different because it provided irrefutable visual evidence. There could be no debate about whether this happened. No questions about the reliability of witness testimony. The camera had seen it. The photograph proved it. When the war ended in August 1945 with Japan's surrender, the machinery of international justice began to turn. War crimes tribunals were established across Asia to prosecute those responsible for atrocities committed during the conflict. The photograph of Leonard Siffleet's execution was presented as evidence. The man who wielded the sword, Yasuno Chikao, was identified, located, and arrested. He was tried before a military tribunal in 1946. The evidence against him was overwhelming, not just the photograph, but testimony from witnesses present at the execution and documentation of the orders under which he had acted. He was convicted of war crimes. The sentence was death by hanging. In 1946, that sentence was carried out. But here's where the story becomes more complex than simple revenge or justice served. Yasuno Chikao was not acting independently. He was following orders within a military system that had determined captured intelligence operatives were unlawful combatants subject to summary execution. The tribunals had to grapple with difficult questions. How far up the chain of command does responsibility extend? Is a soldier who carries out illegal orders guilty of a crime, or is he simply a tool of the system that commanded him? The photograph that seemed to provide such clear evidence of guilt actually raised thorny questions about agency, obedience, and the nature of war crimes in hierarchical military structures. These same questions would echo through subsequent tribunals at Nuremberg and Tokyo, and they remain unresolved in international law to this day. For Leonard Siffleet's family back in Australia, the photograph brought a terrible kind of closure. They had spent months not knowing whether he was alive or dead, whether he might be in a prisoner of war camp somewhere, whether he might eventually come home. The notification that he was officially confirmed killed in action would have arrived sometime in 1944 or early 1945. Whether they were shown the photograph at that time, whether they asked to see it, or were spared the sight of their son's final moment, the records don't say. What we do know is that his mother kept his room unchanged for years after the war, a shrine to a son who left one day and never returned. His service record, preserved in the Australian War Memorial Archives, lists him simply as Sergeant Leonard George Siffleet, Australian Army, Z Special Unit, killed in action, October 24, 1943. The photograph itself began a different kind of journey after the trials concluded. It entered the historical record, appearing in books about the Pacific War, in museum exhibitions about World War II atrocities, in documentary films about the treatment of prisoners of war. It became, in the language of historians, an iconic image, one of those photographs that comes to represent an entire category of human experience. When people think about the Pacific War's brutality, about the particular horrors faced by special operations personnel, about the fate that awaited captured Allied soldiers in that theater, they think of this image. It carries an enormous weight of representation. Before we go further, I want to pause and acknowledge something. This story is difficult. The history it documents is painful, but it's also important. If you're finding value in this kind of detailed historical research, if you believe these stories need to be told with accuracy and respect, I'd be grateful if you'd take a moment to like this video. That simple action helps the algorithm show this content to other people who care about preserving these histories. And if you have thoughts about how we should remember events like this, or questions about aspects of this story, the comment section below is a space for respectful discussion. I read every comment, and your perspectives often shape future videos. Thank you for being here. Now let's talk about what this photograph means. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Photographs lie, even when they show the truth. What I mean is this. The photograph of Leonard Siffleet's execution shows us exactly what happened in that fraction of a second. A man kneeling, a sword raised, the moment before death. But it doesn't show us the 2 weeks of interrogation that preceded that moment. It doesn't show us the months of dangerous work in the jungle before capture. It doesn't show us the training that prepared him for this mission, or the childhood that made him who he was, or the family waiting back home who would grieve his loss. It shows us only the end, and in doing so, it threatens to reduce Leonard Siffleet to nothing more than a victim, a symbol, a cautionary tale about the horrors of war. The photograph also doesn't show us Pattiwal and M. Reharing with the same clarity. They were there. They knelt in that same sand. They faced that same fate. But the camera focused on Siffleet, and history followed the camera's focus. In most English-language accounts of this event, Pattiwal and Reharing are mentioned briefly, if at all, their names sometimes rendered incompletely, their stories largely untold. This asymmetry in historical memory is itself a kind of injustice, one that we perpetuate every time we tell this story without deliberately centering their sacrifice alongside Siffleet's. The photograph was taken by someone who intended it to serve a purpose, but that purpose, whatever it was, has been subverted by history. Instead of serving as Japanese propaganda or military documentation or a deterrent to Allied intelligence operations, it became evidence in war crimes prosecutions. It became a tool for education about the Pacific War's brutality. It became a memorial to those who died in the shadows of covert operations. The photograph's meaning has been shaped by everyone who has looked at it, reproduced it, written about it, taught with it. And in that sense, the photograph no longer belongs to the person who took it. It belongs to history, which means it belongs to all of us who grapple with what it shows. But we must grapple carefully. There's a voyeuristic danger in images of execution. They can become spectacle, their horror consumed and then discarded in an endless scroll of historical trauma. Showing this photograph without context, without telling Leonard Siffleet's story, without naming Pattiwal and M. Reharing, without explaining the circumstances that led to this beach and this moment, risks reducing these men to mere objects of pity or examples of enemy cruelty. Context doesn't make the image less disturbing, but it does make it more meaningful. It transforms it from spectacle into testimony. The photograph also raises difficult ethical questions that remain unresolved. Should such images be shown at all? Do we have the right to display someone's final moment, particularly when they had no choice in whether that moment would be recorded? On the other hand, isn't there a duty to bear witness, to not look away from the realities of what humans do to each other in wartime? These questions don't have easy answers. Different museums, archives, and historians have made different choices about whether and how to display this image. Some blur it or obscure the most graphic elements. Some show it in full, believing that the historical significance outweighs the discomfort. Some refuse to display it at all, arguing that the dead deserve privacy that transcends historical importance. What we can say with certainty is this. Leonard Siffleet did not die so that he could become a symbol. He died because he was captured while carrying out a mission for his country, and the military force that captured him decided to execute him. The symbolic meaning we've attached to his death came later, imposed by history and by those of us who look at that photograph and try to understand what it means. We've made him represent the risks of covert warfare, the brutality of the Pacific Campaign, the courage of those who serve in the shadows, the importance of international law governing the treatment of prisoners. He carries all of these meanings now, whether he would have wanted to or not. In the decades since the war ended, Aitape Beach has returned to its ordinary existence. The sand is still coarse. The waves still break at 7 or 8 second intervals depending on the tide and season. There is no memorial marker at the location where the executions took place. No plaque, no monument, no indication that this place witnessed something that would reverberate through history. Local residents may or may not know what happened there. For most people walking that beach, it's just a beach, a place to fish, to swim, to watch the sunset. Only those who know the history carry the weight of what that particular stretch of sand represents. This absence of physical memorialization raises its own questions. Should there be a marker? Would it matter? Physical monuments can focus memory and provide places for reflection and mourning. But they can also become empty rituals, places we visit to feel like we've remembered without really engaging with what we're supposed to be remembering. Perhaps the photograph itself has become the memorial, more permanent and more widely seen than any stone monument could ever be. Perhaps the act of telling this story over and over, generation after generation, is the memorial that matters. The Australian War Memorial in Canberra holds extensive archives related to Leonard Siffleet's service and death. Researchers can access his service records, copies of the photograph, documentation from the war crimes trial, and various historical analyses of his mission and capture. The memorial's role is preservation, ensuring that the evidence remains available for future generations to study, question, and learn from. But preservation is only the first step. The evidence has to be engaged with, interpreted, taught. Otherwise, it's just paper and photographs in climate-controlled storage, significant only to archivists and the occasional specialist researcher. That's where we come in. Every time someone learns this story, every time someone sits with the discomfort of that photograph and asks difficult questions about what it means, Leonard Siffleet's death becomes something more than a historical footnote. It becomes a lens through which we can examine larger questions about war, justice, memory, and how we honor those who serve. This is not comfortable work. It shouldn't be. The photograph doesn't allow comfort, but discomfort that leads to understanding, that generates thoughtful reflection about difficult topics, that motivates us to preserve and share these stories. That kind of discomfort is valuable. We're approaching the end of this story, but before we conclude, I want to ask you one more thing. If you've watched this far, if you've engaged seriously with this history, would you consider sharing this video? Not for the algorithm or the metrics, but because these stories matter and they deserve to be known. Share it with someone who cares about World War II history. Share it in a classroom if you're a teacher. Share it wherever you think it might generate thoughtful discussion about how we remember difficult histories. And if you haven't already subscribed, please do. This channel is dedicated to telling stories like this one. Stories that don't always make it into mainstream documentaries. Stories that require patient research and careful handling. Stories that matter. Your subscription directly supports that work. Thank you.